Its defence spending is now less than that of France and a tenth of the United States. Is Russia's military really such a threat to the established world order? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello and a welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. A top NATO general is saying that Russia is the main threat to European and Atlantic security, but its defence spending's fallen sharply in recent years, and the Kremlin says that trend is going to continue. So is it time for a rethink on military Russia?
Western nations see Russia as a threat. That much was clear when the head of NATO told the US Congress earlier this year that Russia was becoming more assertive. It regularly shows off its military power. Exercises in Siberia last year involved 300,000 troops, the biggest since the Cold War more than 3 decades ago. And in March last year, President Putin boasted that Russia had tested new nuclear missiles that can't be intercepted. But Russia's defence spending is dwarfed by others, $61 billion for 2019 compared to the US's $649 billion. In fact, it's not even in the top 5 countries for military spending. So is Russia's military really a threat to the established world powers, or does the real danger lie elsewhere?
Well, joining us from Moscow, we have Evgeny Buzhinsky, former Lieutenant General in the Russian Army. At the round table with me, Justin Bronk here, a research fellow at the think tank RUSI. Robert Fox is with me, defence editor at the London Standard, and Tim Reilly, founder of the Arctic Advisory Group, who's been talking a lot to NATO people about the threats or not that Russia may well pose. Thank you very much for coming in. Evgeny, on the face of it, it would appear with the spending, with the manpower, with a conscript army, that Russia would pose no real threat in a ground war. Is that a realistic view of it?
Well, first of all, you see, this military spending, these figures are very tricky ones. You see, of course, Russia doesn't have to keep or finance more than 400 bases and military objects all over the world. Doesn't need to finance a global presence. I'm speaking about the United States. Global presence in every corner of the globe. You see, 2 major characteristics of any armed forces are combat readiness and equipment. From the viewpoint of equipment, you see, if you take hardware in all services comparable, you'll see that Russian equipment is 5 to 6 times cheaper. Let's say F-35 aircraft costs, well, there is no exact figure, but around $130 million US. A Russian Sukhoi 35, which is practically the same aircraft. In some way it's better, in some way it's worse, but it costs around $30 million.
Okay, so we're not comparing like with like. And of course, Russian rubles buy Russian machinery. Can I just bring it here for a little while? We'll come back to you in just a moment, Evgeny. Robert, so does that suggest that because they don't have to spend so much money, that their costs are that much lower, that in fact they are a match conventionally for American forces?
I think there is great concern that they are a match for most NATO forces in continental Europe. And that has been stated quite explicitly by the British command at the moment, because I think we are apt to get a bit dazzled by figures, league tables, Britain, France, Saudi Arabia, they interchange. And what bang are you getting for your buck, and what do you really want to do? This is becoming an ever greater question for the medium powers. And the great advantage that Russia has, and I'm sure Evgeny can point to this, they have immense experience now of what they're using. They have been in Syria been at it and learning lessons and learning them quite hard at times, certainly since 2015 and a lot before. And a lot of what it seems to me what President Putin is doing, he is learning from experiences, say, in Georgia Ossetia, 2008, as well as the difficulties on the western flank of the Russian Federation or the eastern flank of NATO, and that awful problem, I think, and it is a problem in my book anyway, called Ukraine.
Justin, your book, Russia's New Ground Forces, in what sense are they new?
Well, what Russia has spent the years since particularly Georgia doing is trying to modernize without making too great a leap, trying to solve a lot of the problems which had plagued the divisional scale organization of the Russian ground forces, ground troops, for example, of undermanning by moving to a system centered around battalion tactical groups, so smaller deployable units, but with full manning, better trained, more professional, greater proportion of professional soldiers to conscripts, and also what they call a full army set. So within each battalion tactical group, you see at least a plan to have tanks, recovery vehicles, artillery, air defense, electronic warfare, mine laying, all of the bridging, all of the ingredients that you would need for a division, but at a smaller scale, so that each small battalion tactical group, which sits somewhere between a British battalion and an American brigade combat team in terms of size, can fight without needing to pull in organic support if it needs to.
Are you suggesting that the American or Western forces would be more cumbersome?
Western forces tend to rely partially for the fact, well, partially because they can, but also because it's more efficient if you can do it, on almost, if you like, just-in-time external organic support. So whether that's air support, resupply, naval fire support, they count on having good communications, excellent network access and data links to be able to draw in a lot of firepower from outside the immediate army formations. So, for example, you see in NATO, approximately 80% of NATO's firepower is air-delivered, theoretical firepower. Around 70% of Russian firepower is artillery and is delivered through the ground forces. So in terms of fire missions. So they rely much more on self-contained units.
Yeah, and you see, one of the other problems, Tim, perhaps, and say whatever you want, this is just my line of thought at the moment, is that their cyber security, their cyber attacking capabilities are so much greater that let's say Western forces were mobilized, they could be almost neutralized by the time they get to a theater of war.
Well, I'm not sure they'd be neutralized, but I think it's part of a broader point that since the breakup of the Soviet Union, what you saw was Russia not having enough money for hardware. So they went very much into research and development, and they maintained their testing sites, and we did neither. And so what you're seeing with weapons that are being deployed in Syria now, and the advent of cyber, and what actually Justin is saying as well, is a new form of warfare. It's not particularly new in terms of military people, but it's an evolving one. And therefore, cyber in itself, I don't think the Russians are under any illusions that this would be a game changer. But in terms of working with new weapon systems, new technologies, coordination with intelligence, then cyber certainly does have a big effect. And it is a threat, but equally so is ours, is very proficient as well. So I see it as rather not in isolation cyber per se. It's a tool of war, but it's how it has been inculcated or included now in new technologies allied to intelligence. And this is what the Russians have been doing, since, in my view, since the breakup of the Soviet Union.
So this is an underestimation by other nations of Russia's capability?
Well, I don't think it's underestimation. I think it's more a question of when the Soviet Union collapsed, we looked at it as a dividend. In the UK, for instance, we diverted money from defense into welfare and health, and NHS, which makes sense. The Russians, having no money at that time, knew they couldn't do hardware or unlimited software. So they went very much back to the drawing board and looked at basic technologies, research and development. And they kept their test sites operating as well, which is something which we did, certainly in the UK, we didn't do much of. We lost an awful lot of capability. So it's not really surprising what they have done. We would have been at the same stage ourselves had we maintained our spend.
Let's put this to Evgeny. I mean, this ties in with your time in the military. I think you retired about 9 years ago. And when you retired from the army, you became involved in the pushing, the selling, if you like, of the Russian military machine to outside people as well. Did you see this change in the forces?
Yes, of course. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, we lost a lot. Actually, the first decade of the 2000s, they were not very productive from the viewpoint of reforming of the Russian armed forces, especially the question of re-equipment. But starting from the year 2009, the the speed of the reform increased greatly. Now, actually, 66% of the hardware in the Russian armed forces are modern ones. To say nothing of the new types of weapons, which, Russia is ahead of the world. I mean, hypersonic, United States does not have hypersonic weapons. In Russia, hypersonic is already operational.
You'll have to help me with what a hydrosonic weapon is. It sounds like something hypersonic.
Yeah.
It's obviously high frequencies of sound.
No, it's 20 speed of Mach.
Yeah.
Plus 6.
It could not be intercepted by any modern system. That's all very simple.
You guys, you have to say whatever you want, whenever you want.
So, sorry. One of the interesting things, though, about the way that Russian hypersonic technology has been politically used so far is that Mr. Putin has made a lot of statements around its impact or supposed impact on the strategic nuclear balance, because, of course, Russia is still the only country that can compete and, indeed, in some cases, overmatch the United States in the nuclear realm. But arguably, it's completely irrelevant there because ICBMs cannot be reliably intercepted anyway.
Intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Indeed. So the strategic nuclear balance hasn't changed. Russia can annihilate the United States as well as everywhere else in the world. That hasn't changed. No American defense system has come close to even threatening a fraction of Russia's strategic arsenal. Where the hypersonics really matter to the West, but interestingly don't seem to be perceived as so important, at least in Russian statements, is in what they do to more operational or tactical level exchanges, the ability to penetrate, for example, Patriot or THAAD batteries defending, say, points of assembly, supply depots, command centers, aircraft carriers. Yeah. And it's in those tactical engagements where theater ballistic missile defense is a major American advantage, where these maneuverable hypersonic missiles, such as the Iskander sort of adaptation, or the Kinjal, are actually a game changer, because it means that Russia has the ability to penetrate tactical defenses, which it didn't have before.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in essence, the way I look at it is that the pre-escalation phase now is, at the moment, probably Russia may well be leading that. And some of these weapons, hypersonic, the implications of them is that the warhead that is being attached to them is, in terms of kinetic energy, can do almost as much destruction as an atomic weapon. So the dilemma the West has is that our only response to that type of weapon with equal kinetic energy would be to release a nuclear weapon. So I suspect, therefore, that some of the talk that's going on, INF treaties and things like that, about changing the framework, is there precisely so that we can adapt to this new type of threat, which I suggest emanates right back to research laboratories in the early 90s, as the General said, when they went back to the board and took out a pencil and paper and a rather powerful computer as well, probably, and began to look at the actual physics of weapons and the basis of it. And we're seeing that, those sort of weapons appearing now in theatre that have been going on for 10 to 20 years, resulting in hypersonic weapons.
You're much more expert in your field than I am. Please feel free to ask Evgeny a question if you'd like to.
I was going to ask briefly, despite the sort of progress on some of these more exotic weapon systems, particularly the Kinjal and other hypersonics, and the modernization of the nuclear triad, do you see any move to roll out some new generation weapons in the ground forces? Because while the T-14, the Armata, and the Kurganets IFV have been shown in parades, the order volumes appear to be very small. And yes, while, as you say, the proportion of quote-unquote modern equipment in Russian ground forces is very high now, it's still modernized versions of the same T-72s, the T-90 derivation, T-72.
Okay, questions have to be relatively short on this program, Justin. Thank you very much indeed. But Evgeny, I think you got the drift.
Well, first of all, about new Armata or Kurgan ACV, Well, of course, there are not so many, but they are operational already. But there are not so many in the armed forces because they cost. That's to be frank. But as for modernized T-72 or T-90, its its quality it's high. And it's comparable to any Western tank. It can compete with any armor in any NATO country. As for the first of all, the Air Force is fully modernized. The new planes, Sukhoi 35, Sukhoi 30, 27, 25. Long-range bombers also quite modern. Ground forces, the major thrust for the last 10 years has been made to electronic warfare, command and control, and intelligence. That was the actually areas where Russia was lagging behind the United States. Now it's, in my opinion, it catched up. At least.
Sorry, Evgeny, I'm going to ask Robert to come in because I don't know whether he wants to ask you a question, but I have a question for him as well.
No. What I'm fascinated is that we've gone down order of battle. We're actually talking in a term of strategic currency, absolutely the language of the Cold War still.
Yeah.
Of confrontation. Yeah. What I want to know from the general and from the fellow panelists, how does all this work in the new strategic context? Because we're going to have ragged wars, undeclared wars. We're going to have Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, just to name Somalia, the Sub-Sahel. It's going to go on for generations now. Now, where does all this fit in? How do you pursue your interests? Is it still going to be the collision of the two bullfrogs, the alliances led by the US on the one hand and by now the Russian Federation on the other? We've got whole new, even geopolitically, zones opening up, like the Arctic. Where is all this going?
We'll come to the Arctic.
Plus, of course, the elephant in the room, China.
Well, I don't know whether that was a question or a statement, Evgeny.
No, how does it work?
Your response.
Yeah.
Well, it's not a question; it's a statement. But you see, if we speak about the Arctic, Arctic is a natural concern and responsibility of Russia, because Russia has the longest coastline along the Arctic Ocean. It's very good that Russian leadership and Russian MOD did so great a job to reinforce and to re-establish its military presence in the Arctics. As for the geostrategic context. Russia doesn't threaten anybody, but our Russian concern has always been to protect its territory, which has been invaded so many times in the past centuries that we have this experience and this responsibility to defend ourselves.
Okay, Tim, you're from the Arctic Advisory Group. America seems to be playing a little bit hot and cold, if you'll forgive the use of words there, with the politics of the region. Evgeny's saying that this is Russian territory. It is an area of concern, is it not, that this could actually be a trigger for something?
Well, on this one, I'm sort of firmly with the Arctic Council, and the most essential member of the Arctic Council is actually Russia. I wrote about this last week in the Financial Times, actually. And Russia, by far, is the indispensable nation in the Arctic Council and the Arctic. And its loss from the Arctic Council would be akin to the United States leaving NATO. Scientifically, geographically, information-wise, as a forward-mounting base into the region for everybody, it is absolutely essential, and it is kept to all the rules and regulations of the Arctic Council. And funnily enough, the original founder of a predecessor to the Arctic Council was Mikhail Gorbachev in 1986 in Murmansk, when he suggested that this area should be designated a free zone, a zone of peace, and that there was to be no discussion of nuclear weapons, and it was to be really mandated by.
Well, do you think it will remain so?
I think it will. But one of the things that's already been brought to our attention here is this. My worry there is one of intentions and capabilities.
Yeah.
And I totally agree. And I'm almost of that generation myself. that what we are doing, it seems to me, from the NATO point of view, to some extent, is basing our tactics and our response in terms of intentions rather than in capabilities rather than in terms of intentions. Russia has been very clear about the Arctic for well over 100 years that this is its back door. It was never able to exploit it because of the ice conditions, and now as the environment changes, obviously there are opportunities for it. If anything,
and it also has over 40 ice-breaking vessels
it has
compared
46,
to one.
Some of which are nuclear powered. In terms of the polar code, they have put troops along some of the islands in the Arctic, which is well known. But that was only at the insistence of the Arctic Council, of which Russia is a member, who commissioned the IMO, International Maritime Organization, to provide a law for the use of the Northern Sea Route, linking Eurasia across Russian territory, a lot of Russian territory. And within that code, the Polar Code said there had to be provision for oil field response, major evacuation, health and safety, this search and rescue, so which the Russians have obviously put troops out there as the only people capable of that, and then are accused of militarizing the area. So I have some reservations, therefore, I think we are perhaps overplaying the Arctic. The real threat there, in my view, and I know Russia has a difficult view of this, is the real threat there is probably China.
OK, I'm getting the sense that we started this off by questioning Russia's military capability on the basis of occasional newspaper reports like the one 2 weeks ago that it may have sent a beluga whale with a camera on it into Norwegian waters because it didn't have much choice because its military machine was so degraded. But that is definitely not the way that any one of you at this table see it. Justin.
Well, this is a Freudian displacement. Actually, this is where it is a very important point that you've raised. It's this sort of cartoonish portrayal of the threat, if the general will forgive me, in inverted commas, that the popular press loves to go for. And it doesn't go into this thing. Actually, in conceiving, following the discussion of the world in which we're operating, which is what I was trying to get at, it was a statement with a question. We are in a new strategic context. What I find depleted in the West, particularly in Europe, for all the bluff about it, there has been an absolute neglect of really forward-looking military science about how you use military, what we're working in. And that's why you get this very fragmented discussion in the press. That's a statement. That's an observation from my experience. Now, where we go from with all this, I don't know, because there's a whole area in Russia's capability, and particularly in European NATO, leaving Turkey out of it for once, where there is a big question mark, and it's personnel. It's manpower, with aging populations, with disinclination in the West to serve, with the state of the demographic economy as well as the economy in the wider Russian Federation. This is the big question, I think, for the next generation.
Yeah. Justin, it would be unwise to sort of treat the Russian military machine lightly, as perhaps that story about the beluga whale suggested.
I think the overall picture is, if one tries to step back from the ideological sort of positions a bit, is relatively clear. NATO has a commitment to its eastern members, particularly the Baltic states, having allowed them into NATO. It has a commitment to defend them under Article 5. That is problematic on a conventional military analysis. If Russia were to put forces in, or there were to be an Article 5 trigger, it is very difficult to reinforce quickly enough and with heavy forces to...
And by the way, that's why a lot of NATO planners didn't want to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, so that is, from the NATO position, it is difficult because Russia has the military capability, indisputably, to have local, temporary dominance in the Baltic states, should it wish to. Yeah. And that is a problem for NATO because we have a commitment to defend them. From the Russian standpoint, they view the NATO membership and the NATO presence in there near abroad as intolerable.
Quickly, if you would, because...
and therefore, we
I want to go to the General to end the programme, because we only have about a minute and a half less. Your pride in the Russian military, well placed, it would appear, judging by what we've heard here, and not a threat to be treated lightly, as some people might be doing.
Well, I repeat that Russia is not a threat to anybody. As for the Baltics, you see, I've been listening, I've been answering this question for so many times that of late I decided to answer this question very simple. You see, the Baltic problem from the Russian point of view is the problem of phobias, you see. And to discuss phobias, you need to have medical education, some psychiatry.
Can we stick to the Russian military machine for the last minute, if you don't mind, General?
I agree with the general, by the way.
Yeah, you're eating up time, Bob. Eating up time. A modern army for a modern world, would you say?
Well, yeah, of course, and I believe that first of all, today Russian army is quite modern, and it will. I'm sure it will successfully finish its re-equipment program, which is actually will end in 2025. So I don't believe that there is any leader mad enough to start fighting or war with Russia.
Thank you. General Buzhinsky, thank you very much indeed to the three of you at the table. I'm so sorry I have to cut you short on occasions. I feel like a very rude host, but you know, that's the nature of television. We don't have all day, which you do when you sit down to write.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for watching. The Russian military machine, not to be treated lightly, despite what you may have seen or read. You heard it here on Roundtable. From me, David Foster, thank you for watching. Goodbye for now.